We studied finding things for an article. So we did this. We did this for one of the in-class assignments last week, right? One thing I noticed was that if you had not read the article before class and you were reading it for the first time in class, that's very difficult to do. To try to start analyzing an article just from the first 2 pages. Even though they do tell you their argument in the first paragraph, you only have a sentence to try to figure it out. Really, what I usually recommend to all students, like I'm just going to, because this definitely applies to you, not just for this class, but for the rest of your academic careers. Not think you can read something once and then you're done. You've already got that. You don't need to look at it again. No, even when you get to grad school, even when you're a PhD student like I am, I cannot read something once and be done with it. So don't plan your academic day or your week around the idea that you can just skim something and then be done. You cannot, especially in the social sciences. These articles are difficult. They talk about very abstract ideas. They often use words that are jargony that you don't know what they mean. And they often refer to other jargony academic articles that you may not have read. So they're referring, think about the academic conversation is a conversation you're coming into in the middle of. The conversation has already been going on for like years and years and years. So the first time you come to it, it's like walking into a cocktail party where everybody's talking, right? You walk up to this group of people and they've already been talking for a while. It's going to take a while for you as a student to get the hang of what this person is saying, what that person is saying. And every time you encounter an academic article, that's what it's like. It's like a conversation that's already been going on. And the more you read, the more you hang out in that cocktail party and hear those conversations, then the easier it gets. So eventually, maybe about the time that you've gotten your PhD and you've been teaching for a few years, maybe then you could read an article once and be fine. But at your level, there's no way, I don't care how smart you are, there's no way you have all that knowledge that just comes from years and years of practice. So a lot of academic success is just about practice. It really doesn't have anything to do with how smart you are. It just has to do with how much you've been exposed to that conversation that's been going on. Does that make sense? So don't think that, oh, I'm not smart, I can't, go to grad school or anything like that. No, it's just a matter of you need more practice. And especially at this level, a lot of people, you've just not had very much practice yet. So that's why things are difficult. The very first time I went to graduate school, I was much younger than when I went back to graduate school later. And I remember, and I was also switching, I was in a different field. I was an English lit major. So I was so overwhelmed that first year of getting a master's degree in this field, because I would read stuff and I would have no idea what they were saying. So that's very common, but don't let it discourage you. When I went back after having worked in DC for like 10 years, I went back to grad school and I was like, oh my gosh, I thought this was hard. That's, I was amazed. So once you see that in yourself, you realize some of the misconceptions you had about how difficult things were. It's just a matter of you being very young and not having been exposed to these things for a long period of time yet. That's all it is. Don't ever think that you can't do it, because you can. You totally can. So if you want to do this as a career, it's totally accessible, I think, to all of you. So anyway, so yeah, so when you're analyzing an argument, which is one of the options that you have on the in-class essay, you definitely do not want to pick an article that you have not yet read. You've got to pick one of the articles that you've read for the class. And I always say, you read it first, read it casually. Don't put all this pressure on yourself, to take notes on every little thing, because you're going to get lost in the forest for all the trees. Like every tree will look really interesting. But what you want to do is just sit on your back porch with a cup of tea or something and your dog in your lap and just read this and don't worry about whether you get it or not. You're like, I'm just going to see. And then when you're done, I think you'll have a better idea of what the overall takeaway was. When your roommate walks by and asks you what you were reading, you can just say, oh, it was something about this. You can usually get the picture of the overall forest. You might tell them about some little trees, but you know what I mean? So you just don't, it's a way of like reducing your anxiety about reading a difficult academic article for the first time. So after you've done that, then you can go back, you come to class, and then you start analyzing that argument. I've handed you, like the copy of it. You can flip through it and you can find things a lot easier. You had not encountered that argument before, or that article before. So a couple things to remember if you have trouble finding the propositions of an article, then look for the evidence. Sometimes the evidence may be more apparent to you. And so what kinds of evidence is the author using or offering? And then think, okay, what are they trying to prove by showing me all this evidence? So that's another sort of like a backdoor way to find the main propositions of an argument. And then also remember the thing I said about the assumptions. Finding the assumptions, you can always find the assumptions by asking what kind of theoretical approach it is. And then thinking about how the other theoretical approaches would disagree with those assumptions. What would they say in response? Does that make sense? Things I think I've already said before, but just reiterating and trying to cement it into your brains, this easy tips for succeeding in college life. I don't think tech support is ever going to help. So. Okay, and then also I thought of this little handy thing. In quantitative science, you have order of operations. So we can have an order of operations for essay writing. So I really want to strongly encourage you to do this on Wednesday. The first order of operations is to first read the entire prompt carefully, of course. Everybody knows that you're going to read the prompt, but are you going to read it carefully? Make sure you understand all of the parts of the question. Ask for clarification if there is any word that you don't understand. Just make sure you notice how many parts of the question there are. Is the question asking you to do 3 different things, 4 different things? And then make sure that you've answered all those parts of the question in your essay answer. The second thing you should do is first go on a scavenger hunt, find the evidence that you need, the relevant evidence that seems relevant to that question in all your materials. You can bring all your notes, all handwritten or printed out notes that you have. You certainly should bring all of the articles with you. So you have all of this material there on your desk. That's everything you need to know. All you have to do is find evidence in that stack of materials that you have that seem relevant to answering the question. Okay. Because remember, your answer should always be supported by the evidence. You're doing the same thing that the articles are doing. You're just doing it for an essay question rather than, just making an academic argument. So what I also decided I wanted you to do is I'm going to have on the sheet of instructions that I hand out with the questions on it on Wednesday, use the back of it to write an outline of your essay. Don't just start free writing. It's not creative writing class. You want to have a well-structured essay. So you can start with making a list of all the evidence that you have. Start there because this is a lot faster. Don't think of your answer and then start looking for evidence because that's going to take a lot longer. You're going to run out of time. So find the evidence first, then list it. Then you can group similar evidences together. What do you think that's going to do if you're grouping the similar evidences together? What does that suggest?
Down your argument.
Yeah, and they might become the body paragraphs.
Yeah.
Because they're similar things, right? So those groupings are going to be kind of like your body paragraphs for the essay. So that's going to help you take a big problem that's going to seem like it can seem a little overwhelming, and you break it down in this step-by-step process. So after you've done all of that, then, and only then should you write your thesis statement. What is your thesis statement? I've said many times, what's the thesis? The answer to the question, the short answer to the question. Yeah. So I have a little example that I came up with. Say you come into class and this is the essay prompt. I promise you it's not going to be the essay prompt. Describe the mating behavior of the Australian mongoose. How does it find its mate? How does it rear its young? How does this behavior differ from the African wildebeest? Note this essay prompt has 4 parts. Okay. So first up in the order of operations, search textbook, articles, and/or notes for all available information on mongooses. And you're good, or maybe it's mongoose. I don't know. I did not look it up. And then you're going to make a list of all of the relevant information. So everywhere that your articles or your textbook or your notes talks about mongooses, that's a source, a potential source of evidence that you can use to answer this essay prompt. Okay. And then you just do the same thing. You group similar evidences together. They become like body paragraphs. So you decide these are going to be the body paragraphs. I've got a lot on this particular aspect of it. Those are going to become the body paragraph. And finally, based on the above here, you write a short version of your answer based on those body paragraphs, based on all those evidences you found. So does that make sense with mongooses instead of liberalism and realism? You know what the question is going to ask you to, you're going to need to be able to describe realism, liberalism, and constructivism. So go ahead and think already, like what sources am I going to cite to do that? Because you need to cite something, like it'll be partial credit if you can describe realism, but it'll be full credit if you can describe realism and cite a source. Snyder says in this article that realism is such and such a thing. Or chapter 7, yeah, I will have all the sources listed on the instruction sheet and how to cite them. So yesterday, last week, whenever I say yesterday, I always mean the previous class period, not yesterday. We introduced the critical theories, and I said critical theories ask how the world came to be the way it is today, and how can we make it better? So the assumptions include the assumptions for all, just like realism and liberalism have certain assumptions, critical theories also have certain assumptions. The main assumptions that all critical theories have, all of these are different kinds. There's the 4 talked about in chapter 7. They all assume that no idea or theory is objective or neutral. So all theories are views of the world that emerge from a particular time in a particular place. So they're all limited by that. What critical theories do in order to deal with that problem, because they say it's not that you shouldn't, it's just that you can't. You can't remove yourself from the social world and get the God's eye point of view. So all theories emerge from the social world in which they are embedded. And their view is always limited by their particular time and place in that social world. So, so that's the historical context part. So historical context is really important for critical theory. That's why they say, I said on last week, that history matters. That if you could boil down critical theory to 2 things, that's the first one, right? History matters. It's not irrelevant. How we got here is important to understand the historical context of every theory. Every theory comes out of a particular historical context. Okay, so that's the history matters part of. And then the second part of the critical theories is the normative part, which is the ICA. So, so unlike the rationalist theories, which say that morality is not an issue in politics, it's an issue for religion or for other things. But the rationalist theories kind of say morality is not something that we're interested in examining. Morality is for other areas. Politics, our theory just is going to focus on the cold rationality of the situation. So they're so they have this kind of amoral, we distinguish that from immoral, this amoral, this idea that morality is not relevant to it. And we've already encountered some criticism of that idea, some of the problems with that. The one that we've encountered most often was that one where doesn't it seem like that, like in the Post article, that was the other article that we had, the one by Paul Post describing realism. He says, problem with realism is it seems to justify Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that's one of the main criticisms. Because they say, because realism, all of the rationalist approaches, which is realism, liberalism, constructivism, some types of it. Constructivism is that middle ground theory, so it's kind of a bridge between the two. They all take this sort of explicitly, like, we're just looking at the rationality of the situation. Morality is not an issue. So that's contrasted to these critical theories, which are explicitly normative theories. They say morality does matter. There is a right and wrong. There's always a right and wrong because there's always a side that's more powerful and there's a side that's less powerful. So all of the critical theories are on the side of the less powerful. They're critiquing the more powerful. No matter how they're doing that, that's the difference between the different types. Remember I said last week, like where they're locating the source of the injustice is the difference between the different types of critical theories. But all of the critical theories have that assumption that the world is unjust in some ways, in various ways. So that's an assumption that they're starting to work with. Where they locate the source of that injustice depends on what type of critical theory it is. But you can say, like all critical theories start with that assumption. The status quo of the world as it is today is unjust in various ways. And so they want to change that. So they want to understand how it came to be that way. And then they also want to change it. Like the textbook said, sometimes they're not super explicit at imagining how a just world would look exactly in like a great deal of detail, because the main focus right now is just on deconstructing the current injustice. And to a certain extent, we're kind of limited. Like I said last week, it's hard to imagine a world without racism because it's been with us for so long, for so many centuries. It's been a part of human life. So it's really, really hard to imagine what that would look like without it. Yes, Anthony.
So all critical theories have a secular view of justice and morality, and believe that injustice.
To get back to your question last week, you said, aren't they morally relative? You see how they're the opposite now. Like all critical theories are normative. They're explicitly not morally relative. They are taking a moral position.
Despite believing in moral relativism.
No, they don't believe in moral relativism. That's what I'm telling you. It's exactly the opposite. Where are you seeing moral relativism? Like if they're making a statement, the world is unjust, that is not morally relative. It's saying it is unjust. It's not saying, depending on where you stand, it might be just. They're not. They're just saying it is unjust.
So that's a core assumption, right?
That is a core assumption, yes. So think of it as the opposite of moral relativism. Like in some ways, the rationalist theories could be morally relative because they say morality doesn't matter at all. It's not part of the equation. And so critical theories are saying, no, we are going to take a moral position here that all politics is about power, and all power relationships are hierarchical and thus unjust. So no matter where they're locating the source of that injustice, you have Marxism talks a lot about classes, different economic classes, feminism, gender equality, inequality. What else? We have post-colonialism and the post-structuralism. The most difficult one to understand is the post-structuralism, because that's really all just about this. This is post-structuralism. So it's pretty broad and it can apply to many different things. In some ways, I guess it's the most broad. So if you think about, and also here's the difference between constructivism and critical theories, because don't they both have to deal with ideas, right? So what's the difference? The difference is the normative. is that constructivists are interested in ideas, but they're not necessarily, some of them are also critical theories. There's critical constructivists, but not all of them. The critical constructivism is interested in ideas, but it can study, some constructivists can study ideas in a sort of rationalist way, like the realists and the liberals. They're just saying, what are the ideas that are influencing? The critical constructivists would say, how are those ideas linked to power? Because ideas are always linked to power. And then the post-structuralists say, let's look at the role of language in reinforcing those hierarchies. So language can either support existing power hierarchies, or it can critique or challenge or contest those existing. So just like there's fiction that reveals and there's fiction that conceals. You heard that phrase before? Yeah, so that's it. That's the most.
So overall, critical theories is really focusing on criticizing the other theories, basically.
Focusing on criticizing the current world,
Okay.
I would say more so. But yeah, they do criticize the other theories. Yeah, like I had, I think last class period, that question, like, what are the critical theories critical of? They're critical of the current world. They say the current world is unjust in some ways. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess my question is, so critical theories have the assumption that no theory is a neutral or objective, right?
Right.
Does that include critical theories despite the fact that they take an objective stance of?
They're not taking an objective stance. Right. They're not saying that their theories are objective. They're saying no theories can be objective. Realism and liberalism both say we try to present an objective theory. Critical theorists say you're not really, you're saying that it is, but really there are normative implications. There's moral implications to those theories, such as being able, justifying Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example. So even though they're not acknowledging those normative positions, they're still there, is what the critical theorists. So there's some popular saying that, what is that? There's various popular sayings to, one you might not know, you can't be neutral on a moving train. Heard that phrase? The idea that like there's no real neutral position. When you're staying silent and you think you're not taking a position, you're still taking a position. That's okay. What's the phrase that popular way of saying that?
But I know.
But y'all know, because I see some people nodding. Okay, yeah. You think you're not taking a position when you're staying silent. You really are taking a position. You're supporting the status quo. That's what the critical theories are saying about realism and liberalism. They say they're not taking a position, but they really are. They're supporting the status quo, the unjust power structures that exist currently in the world. So yeah, ideas and IPE, International Political Economy. So sometimes students wonder, like, why are we studying Marxism? Is it, the Soviet Union failed? Isn't it irrelevant? Like, it's not a thing anymore, right? So wrong. There is so much of modern life that is influenced by Marxism. Y'all have put forth Marxist theories probably without even realizing it. That's how influential Marxist thought was. So Marx, it's like a mid-19th century. So we've got like 1840s. We'll just round up and say it's the 1850s. So it's 19th century. Marx. And anytime you make an argument that somebody is doing something because they have an economic interest or a financial stake in it, you're making a Marxist argument. Which doesn't mean, it doesn't make you a Marxist. The point is just showing you how influential Marx's ideas were. Is anytime international political economy is just politics plus, like politics is not ever by itself. It's always plus economics equals IPE. So I've mentioned this phrase a few times, material. What do we mean by material power? What does material power mean? Yeah. What do we mean by material power?
Would it just be like having more resources, like more weapons and stuff like that?
Yes, weapons and stuff like that. And so we've talked about like military power and economic power. So
Hard power,
like what?
hard power as opposed to
Hard
soft
power? Yes, as opposed to soft power, which is what? Like
People's ideas of you.
exactly, yeah. Yeah. Say weapons, military, but also economic strength, right? So we've talked about material power as opposed to ideational power before, right? We talked about like power of ideas, like soft power, and everything like that. Marx combines them both. Or what he does is he says that our ideas are influenced by our material condition. The material context in which we exist. The material world, say our financial position in the world, influences how we think about that. So that's what Marx says that's so kind of new, really modern. It really begins like the modern era. Before these ideas were really separated. But Marx is all about understanding how our material conditions, the tangible things of our lives, how we live, affect how we think. So the material conditions of our lives is always influencing how we think about the world. That's basically Marxism. One of the main things. But the other thing, of course, is that idea of revolution. The idea, you see how it's a normative thing. Marx was all about, right? He's describing this is like the industrial area. You see, think about a little bit, but think about Charles Dickens, right? Anything you read by Charles Dickens, it's describing England, you know, in the midst of it's always describing in any Charles Dickens thing, right? It's about poverty, you know, Oliver Twist and Christmas Carol, like always Charles Dickens is describing poverty and how hard life was for the poor in late 19th century England, right? So that's a good image to keep in mind. Marx was in roughly the same era. So he looks at that and he says, this is wrong. So there's the normative theory. This is where Marxism becomes, it is kind of thought of as the influence for all of the other critical theories because of this. Because he says the world as it is today is unjust and we need to change it. So that's basically where all critical theories come from. That makes sense, right? So that's why Marx is so influential. Anytime we say, you know, somebody, you know, what's that? There's another saying that it's hard to convince somebody of something if their job depends on them not believing that thing. You know, if their job is dependent on, say, you know, say you're an oil executive, it might be kind of hard to convince the oil executive of climate change, for example. I mean, maybe not, but people have an interest in certain things, you know, wherever you are in the world, wherever your material position is, you have an interest in either understanding something or not understanding something based on where you're located in the world. So that's basically Marxism, you know. Earlier in previous classes, we talked about like whether the founding fathers wanted to eliminate slavery or not, right? And there was this idea that, well, there, you know, it was They didn't want to because there was economic, right? Marxist, that's influence of Marxism there too.
Basically, what you're saying, if, for example, if you're someone, say in society who's on the lower class being battered down by, say, taxes or whatever, you're gonna be much more critical of what the state and, you know, your government is doing. Whereas if you're benefiting financially, you're not gonna question the political.
Right, or you have a better understanding of the particular systems of oppression if you are the one being oppressed by that particular system.
Right.
You're better positioned. So it doesn't say that other people can't understand it. It's just that it's harder.
Or they just don't choose to.
They sometimes they don't choose to. It doesn't affect their lives. And so if they don't want to look at it, if white people don't want to look at racism, we can ignore it. It's easier. A Black person could want to have that, but there's no way they're going to be able to ignore it because racism is going to impact their lives. So if you're, whatever the system of oppression is, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's ableism, whatever, if you are the one who is being oppressed by that system, you're the one that's best positioned to be able to understand how that system oppresses people because it's happening to you. If you're not somebody who's being affected by that particular type of oppression, then you might be able to understand it, but it's just going to be harder because you don't see it in your life every day. Does that make sense? Yeah, so it's like, and you see how that's also kind of a, it gets back to that idea about positionality. Located within the social world in some places, some place or another. And so that position, where we are in the social world, influences what we're able to see in the social world. Feminism, yeah, okay, let's talk about feminism for a bit. So feminism is, you know, like I said in that video, is seeing the world through a gendered lens. And it's also a recognition that gender is always linked, just like ideas are always linked to power. Gender is always a hierarchy. If you're seeing the world through a gendered lens, you're seeing those hierarchies. You're seeing how those hierarchies play out. So feminist IR is not about just having more women in power. That's one thing, but that can be like, you know, any, you know, it's not enough. Feminist IR is about seeing these gendered relationships. Why is it relationships? Because ideas are always linked to power. Power is essentially, sorry, I can't talk and write at the same time. Power is always essentially is a relationship, right? Relationship. So power relationships. Gender is simply seeing the power, the gendered power relationships that are affecting a particular situation in international politics. You know, there's this assumption that rape is something that happens as a consequence of war. Like if there's a war going on, rape is going to happen. Well, feminist IR would say, no, like rape doesn't happen just because men are men. All men don't rape. Rape happens because of particular ideas about masculinity, about power relationships, about a culture that permits that sort of behavior and sort of turns a blind eye to it. That's why rape happens. Rape doesn't just happen naturally because men are naturally inclined to do that. Rape happens because we have these particular gendered relationships that makes that a condoned behavior, especially like after war, for example. Not because there's anything in men that means that men have to rape women. So you see how this is like using this lens, that's, they call it, looking at the world through a gendered lens, you can see these sorts of things that otherwise you're not going to see because you're not looking for them. You know? What else? That's basically what I wanted to tell you about the critical theories. It's just that main idea. Because I think that's a really good, like, just brief introduction. I came across this book this weekend totally by accident. I was looking for a different book. Of course, here's Max Horkheimer, one of the Anthony, I think, mentioned like the Frankfurt School, like the first week of class, we're going to talk about the Frankfurt School. Frankfurt School is a school in Germany that basically is like where modern critical theories, like 20th century critical theories, come out of. And so Max Horkheimer was one of the founders of the Frankfurt School. And this book is a collection of his essays that date back to the 30s and 40s. But in the preface, the book came out in 1968. You can see how old it is. I inherited it from a sociology professor at UF that I knew. So in the 60s, so he's writing in the preface in the 1960s, specifically in 1968, where there were a lot of student protests. There's a lot of stuff happening where students were very active. There were students for Democratic Society, all these different activist student groups taking place. And so he writes this preface to his essays, and the first thing he says that he's nervous about putting these essays that were written in the 30s out now, because he doesn't want them to be misinterpreted. A lot of stuff happened, right? World War II, fascism, Nazis, those were new things. They didn't yet know how Hitler's regime was going to turn out, So he's writing in the 1930s, though. They're very concerned about it. They're in the midst of it. You have no idea what's going to happen. You don't have no idea of how bad things are. So, so writing in the 1960s, he says something like, it requires getting into the heads of people in the 1930s who the idea of revolution was everywhere, not just in Russia had one. They had this idea that soon the same thing was going to happen in Germany, and it was just going to spread all over the world. Workers' revolutions, right? But he says what they hadn't learned until later is that how much, if that revolution ushers in a dictatorship, then you're worse off. So he says a dubious democracy, for all of its defects, is always, always better than a dictatorship. Seems obvious to us, but we don't say that enough, he says. A dubious democracy, I think this what affected me about this was that it really applies to today. Because there's a lot of really good, legitimate critiques of liberalism, right? And liberal democracy and liberal internationalism. And all of those critiques are absolutely 100% legitimate. But we end the liberal world order, and then we have a world order ruled by China or Russia. We are far, far, far worse off. Those are authoritarian countries that don't even pretend to respect human rights and stuff like that. So we are better with a dubious democracy than we are with a dictatorship. So we don't want to, in our urge to make things better, it's a very admirable urge. We don't want to jump out of the frying pan and into the fire, So he says, he quotes Rosa Luxemburg, who he says, despite her adherence to the Russian Revolution, Rosa Luxemburg, whom so many students venerate, said 50 years ago, the remedy which Trotsky and Lenin have found, the elimination of democracy as such, remember the dictatorship of the proletariat, is worse than the disease it's supposed to cure. So he says to protect, preserve, and where possible, extend the limited freedom of the individual in the face of the growing threat to it, is far more urgent a task than to issue abstract denunciations. In totalitarian countries, youth are struggling precisely for that autonomy, which is under permanent threat in non-totalitarian countries. So it's under threat in non-totalitarian countries. So for example, in other words, in the US, but in totalitarian countries, they don't even have that. So we want to be careful, he says, to not get caught up into these like pseudo revolutionary acts. For the left, to help the advance of a totalitarian bureaucracy is a pseudo revolutionary act. For the right, to support the tendency to terrorism is a pseudo conservative act. Both tendencies are really more closely related to each other than to the ideals to which they appeal for support. So a true conservatism, which takes man's, sorry for the gender neutral language, humanity's spiritual heritage seriously, is more closely related to the revolutionary mentality, which does not simply reject that heritage, but absorbs it into a new synthesis, than it is to the radicalism of the right, which seeks to eliminate them both. So in other words, as you're trying to create a more just world, and you're fighting against injustice, you don't want to create more injustice in a less just world. So to the extent that anything you do does the opposite of what you aim to achieve, it's a pseudo revolutionary, it's a pseudo act. It's not achieving your aims. Yeah, but yeah. The point of this all of this is to show you where critical theories come from and what they're trying to do. That's it.
And the pseudo-revolutionary, that's using like revolutionary in the idea that the critical theories need a revolution to fix whatever issue they think is wrong with the world.
And basically what we have in Russia is like a bunch of leftist groups fighting each other and saying it's more important for us to fight each other than it is for us to fight the fascists. Yeah, yeah, you see how, and then what happens? Hitler and the Holocaust and all these horrible things, because the leftist groups were arguing amongst themselves as to who had the most purist leftist ideology, who was really going to lead to true liberation. So they're focused on that when this horrible thing is coming up behind us, the whole world, and it's going to swamp everybody. So yeah, that so many people of that generation have that critique of, and that's why he was nervous in 1968 about having this book come out where he's got essays written in that context. I haven't read his essays yet, but I imagine some of them might be more focused on critiquing other leftists than they are noticing the huge fascist monster that's about to wipe out 6 million Jews.